On a quiet February morning, in a suburban home nestled in the heart of California, something unimaginable happened. A father and his two teenage children were found dead. Even the family dog lay still. The official report declared it a murder-suicide, a tragic act of a man pushed to the brink. But when you start to examine the details, you realize things don't add up. The man in question wasn't just a father. He wasn't just another suburban neighbor. He was a veteran, a highly skilled pilot who had spent years navigating the skies for major airlines. But his true passion, his real work, wasn't in the cockpit. It was on the ground, behind a keyboard, connecting pieces of a puzzle most of us didn't even know existed. This man had uncovered something so explosive that it could rewrite history. He wasn't a conspiracy theorist shouting into the void. He was precise, deliberate, and methodical, qualities that made what happened to him all the more chilling. He had begun to ask questions about one of the most devastating events in modern history. Questions that pointed fingers where most would never dare to look. What kind of man risks everything to expose the truth? He was a father who adored his children. He was meticulous, protective, and cautious. This wasn't someone prone to reckless actions. Yet, the official story painted a picture of a man who snapped, a man who turned on his family in an unspeakable way. But there's a problem with that story: it doesn't hold up. Witnesses, timelines, forensic details, they all lead to a far darker conclusion. Something was being hidden. But what? And why? Before his death, he was working on something big. His final manuscript claimed to reveal connections that would leave even the most skeptical observer questioning everything they thought they knew. And then, silence. The man, his children, his work, all gone in an instant. Authorities were quick to close the case. A tragic, isolated incident, they said. But behind the scenes, whispers began to spread. Whispers of a cover-up, of forces at play that had far too much to lose if the truth came out. Tonight, we're not just telling a story. We're uncovering a mystery that reaches beyond the walls of that suburban home. We'll walk through the evidence, the contradictions, the hidden details that were never supposed to see the light of day. And by the end, you'll be asking the same question we are: what secret could be so dangerous that an entire family had to be silenced? This isn't just about one man. It's about the lengths people will go to keep certain truths buried. Stay with us until the end, because once you know what he uncovered, you may never see the world the same way again. The morning of February 2nd began like any other in the quiet neighborhood of Murphy's, California. Rows of well-kept homes basked in the soft glow of sunrise, and the streets were silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the hum of a passing car. But by mid-morning, that peace was shattered. The 911 call came from a neighbor who hadn't seen any movement from the family next door. A man known for his punctuality hadn't been out to fetch his mail. The curtains remained drawn. The family dog, always eager for attention, hadn't been heard barking. Something was off, and soon, first responders arrived to check on the family. Inside the house, the scene was nothing short of horrifying. In the living room, the lifeless body of a man was discovered alongside those of his two teenage children, aged 14 and 17. Even the family's Labrador lay motionless nearby. The initial assessment? A murder-suicide. Authorities claimed the father had taken the lives of his children and then his own in a fit of rage or despair. But almost immediately, questions began to surface. For one, neighbors described the man as gentle, patient, and fiercely protective of his kids. He wasn't the kind of person who fit the profile of someone capable of such an act. And then there were the strange details about the scene itself. No signs of forced entry. No witnesses to report any disturbances. And yet, there was an eerie feeling that hung over the house, as though something had gone terribly wrong before the tragedy unfolded. In the days that followed, the news trickled out to the public, but it was quiet, too quiet. The incident was treated as an open-and-shut case. A tragedy, yes, but one with no greater implications. But those who knew the family, and especially the father, weren't satisfied with the narrative. The man in question was not a faceless suburban dad. He was a seasoned professional, a man with a decorated career in aviation and a meticulous personality to match. He was the type to double-check every lock on the door, to notice every small inconsistency. To those who knew him, the idea that he would harm his family was unthinkable. But there was another side to him, one that few people were aware of. In the years leading up to his death, he had begun to delve into research, questioning official stories and following threads that most people ignored. His meticulous nature made him an excellent investigator, and what he uncovered in those final years would send shockwaves through those close to him. Who was he? And why did his death, so tragic and so sudden, seem to carry the weight of a far larger story? Before we answer those questions, let's rewind. Let's go back to the beginning, to the man's early life, his career, and the moment he began walking the fine line between seeking the truth and putting himself in danger. Before that February morning, before the shocking tragedy that left a family shattered, there was a secret. A secret so profound, so dangerous, that its mere existence posed a threat to some of the most powerful people and institutions in the world. And it all began with one man's relentless curiosity. He was a man of precision, a pilot by trade, with years of experience navigating the complexities of the skies. But his real passion, the pursuit that consumed him in his later years, was the search for answers. It started innocently enough, with questions about global events that didn't sit right, inconsistencies that gnawed at him late into the night. In the early 2000s, one event stood out above all others, a tragedy so profound it reshaped the world overnight. To most, the event seemed cut and dry, the official story neatly packaged and disseminated. But for this man, the narrative didn't hold. It wasn't the surface details that caught his attention, it was what lay beneath. He began by compiling reports, poring over every detail he could find. Flight paths, structural analyses, government documents, eyewitness accounts, nothing was too small to escape his scrutiny. His expertise as a pilot gave him a unique perspective, one that allowed him to see things most people missed. And slowly, piece by piece, a troubling picture began to emerge. The man discovered patterns, connections between intelligence agencies, shadowy financial dealings, and global power players. He uncovered names, dates, and transactions that raised more questions than answers. One revelation stood out among the rest, a suspected collaboration between powerful institutions to manipulate events on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. His findings pointed to a web of influence that stretched across continents, implicating individuals in the highest echelons of government and industry. There were ties to global conflicts, economic collapses, and even the very event that had first captured his attention. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous his work became. It wasn't long before he realized he was being watched. His phone calls were interrupted by strange clicks, his emails were met with unexplained delays, and on more than one occasion, he noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his home. Friends reported being questioned about him. Even his family began to notice the pressure. But he refused to stop. He started documenting everything, journals, recordings, and a manuscript he hoped would one day expose the truth. He knew the risks, but he also believed the stakes were too high to turn back. This was bigger than him, bigger than his family. If what he suspected was true, the implications would shake the very foundations of global power. He kept most of his findings to himself, sharing only fragments with a trusted few. He feared that going public too soon would make him an easy target. But in those final months, he became more paranoid, more careful. He encrypted files, changed his routines, and confided in close friends that he believed he was being followed. And then, just days before his death, he made a chilling statement to one of his confidants. "If something happens to me," he said, "it won't be an accident. And it won't be what they say it is." Whatever he had uncovered, it was enough to make him a target. Enough to put his life, and the lives of those around him, in grave danger. And while we still don't know the full extent of what he knew, one thing is certain: the cost of his search for the truth was far greater than he ever imagined. But who is this man? And what exactly did he find that made him such a threat? To answer that, we need to go back to the clues he left behind, the people he confided in, and the questions he dared to ask. As the months passed, the man's obsession with the truth grew. The more he uncovered, the more danger he found himself in. What began as a curiosity, one man asking questions, had transformed into a battle for survival. The deeper he dug, the more the stakes grew, and with it, the ever-looming threat to his life. It wasn't long before he began to notice the signs. At first, they were subtle, fleeting moments of discomfort. A sense of unease that he couldn't shake. But as the weeks wore on, the patterns became undeniable. Unmarked cars parked down the street. Strangers who seemed to linger in his neighborhood. A shadowy figure appearing at the periphery of his vision as he walked home from the grocery store. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings. Friends reported that he was always looking over his shoulder, constantly scanning the area as if someone were following him. His usually composed demeanor began to crack, his once confident air replaced with the palpable tension of a man under siege. Those who were closest to him said he was jumpy, agitated, tired, even. He was losing sleep, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. He started leaving strange, cryptic messages. Nothing overt, nothing that would seem alarming at first. But to those who knew him best, the meaning was clear. He spoke often about his next steps in case something happened to him. He referenced encrypted files, making sure that trusted individuals knew where to look. "If I don't make it, it's not what they say," he told one close friend. "If you don't hear from me, look into everything I've left behind. They won't stop until the truth is buried." He had become a man at war, not with a visible enemy, but with an unseen force that he knew had the power to destroy him. Every conversation, every encounter, felt dangerous. He stopped sharing certain details, realizing that even his trusted friends might not be as trustworthy as they seemed. The walls were closing in. He started to withdraw, distancing himself from family and friends, consumed by his findings and the weight of what he was up against. Those who tried to reach out were met with vague responses, uneasy silences, and cryptic words. Some of his closest colleagues began to pull away, fearful of getting caught in the storm that he had stirred up. The man, once well-connected and surrounded by a network of allies, found himself isolated. His own family noticed the change. His wife, once his confidant and partner, grew concerned as her husband became more secretive and paranoid. At dinner, he would check his phone repeatedly, scan the room for unusual activity, and spend hours locked in his office, reviewing documents and files in a frenzy. "He wasn't the man I married anymore," she would later say in an interview, her voice trembling. "He was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. And I was scared for him." The tension reached a breaking point one evening when the man received a visit that would change everything. A black sedan had pulled into his driveway. Two men, well-dressed and calm, stepped out and approached him. They didn't say much, just the essentials. A warning. One of the men, a tall figure with sharp eyes and a chilling smile, told him, "You've been asking too many questions. You've seen too much. If you continue down this path, we can't promise your safety." The other man remained silent, but his presence was enough to send a shiver down his spine. They didn't need to say more. The message was clear: stop digging, or face the consequences. After that encounter, he changed his routine again. He installed extra security measures in his home, altered his travel plans, and began monitoring his own communications more closely. But the warning had struck a deeper chord. In the days that followed, his paranoia only deepened. He had never been someone to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This was a warning from forces far beyond his control. He knew the stakes now. This wasn't just a matter of uncovering the truth, this was about surviving it. Despite the mounting threats and the sense of inevitability creeping over him, the man refused to back down. He knew that if he remained silent, the truth would remain buried, and the very fabric of global power would remain unchallenged. The people involved in this conspiracy, he realized, were not just powerful, they were untouchable. He began preparing a final report, his last effort to expose the truth, no matter the cost. "I will not be silenced," he wrote in the final entry of his journal. "If something happens to me, I want the world to know what I found. This is bigger than me, bigger than all of us." But they will stop at nothing to keep it hidden. He was running out of time. The threats had become more frequent, the surveillance more intense. He no longer trusted anyone. His once loyal allies were either too scared to help or had been compromised themselves. And though he knew the risks, he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. It was a quiet afternoon when the world first learned of the tragic end that awaited the man and his family. The call came through to local authorities, reporting an apparent family tragedy. The scene was unsettling. Inside a peaceful suburban home, the bodies of the man, his wife, and their 2 children were discovered, all lifeless. The cause of death? A murder-suicide. Or so the authorities claimed. At first glance, the scene seemed to fit the tragic narrative: a man pushed to the edge, possibly succumbing to the pressure of a life filled with paranoia, threats, and the weight of the dangerous knowledge he had uncovered. Yet something about the scene didn't sit right. It was all too neat, too convenient. Everything was laid out with disturbing precision, almost as if someone had arranged the pieces in a manner that suited the narrative they wanted to sell. The authorities quickly moved to close the case. It was simple enough to write it off. A distraught husband, overwhelmed by the paranoia of his discoveries, turned on his family before taking his own life. But the more the investigation unfolded, the more it became clear that the official explanation didn't answer all the questions. The locked doors. The absence of any signs of struggle. The lack of a clear motive for the violence. No one who knew the family could reconcile the idea of the man being capable of such an act, let alone turning on his own children. Something didn't add up. For starters, the doors were all locked from the inside. The windows had been closed. No signs of forced entry. No neighbors had heard any unusual sounds. The family had been in their home, seemingly undisturbed, yet the bodies were found in different rooms, positioned in a way that didn't reflect the chaotic nature of a murder-suicide. Why would someone who was supposedly in a fit of rage, acting out in desperation, take the time to meticulously arrange things as though they were staged? The official narrative hinged on the idea that the man had murdered his wife and children before turning the gun on himself. But the bullet trajectory didn't match the theory. Investigators who reviewed the scene noted that the way the shots were fired seemed inconsistent with what was being claimed. The positioning of the bodies, and the lack of gunshot residue on the man's hands, were strange enough to raise suspicion. How could someone shoot multiple people in a confined space without leaving more physical evidence? The man had been methodical in his research, obsessive about the truth, but he wasn't a violent person. Those who had known him for years, a loving father, a dedicated husband, couldn't reconcile this violent version of him with the man they had respected. He had always been reserved, always careful in his actions, someone who would never lash out in such a manner, especially not toward his own children. Then, there was the matter of the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Key pieces of the investigation seemed to disappear. Files from the family's home office were gone, along with some of the encrypted documents the man had worked tirelessly on. His computer, normally a treasure trove of information about his discoveries, was wiped clean, and the hard drive, which had been carefully secured, vanished from the crime scene. Was this an act of desperation by someone at the edge of their sanity, or was it an attempt to cover up the very thing he had been trying to expose? Another strange detail: the family's home had been under surveillance in the months leading up to the deaths. Authorities had flagged their residents, tracking movements, monitoring emails, and intercepting phone calls. But none of this seemed to be addressed in the official investigation. Why had the family been targeted in this manner? And more disturbingly, why had no one intervened before it was too late? As the investigation continued, the discrepancies became harder to ignore. In the initial reports, the officers involved seemed too eager to wrap things up quickly, dismissing the unusual circumstances as complications of a distressed mind. The press, too, was quick to adopt the murder-suicide theory without questioning the narrative that was being fed to them. But for those who had followed the man's journey, there were only more questions. Was this truly the tragic outcome of a man unraveling under the pressure, or was it something far more calculated? Had he been silenced for what he knew, for what he had uncovered about powerful forces that would stop at nothing to maintain their control? In the days that followed, whispers began to spread. Some claimed that the man's death was a warning to others who might think of speaking out. A statement from the shadows, "This is what happens when you dig too deep." And still, others believed that the family's deaths were not part of a personal breakdown at all, but a deliberate act to eliminate someone who had become a threat to the powers that be. As the funeral took place, those who knew the man were left with haunting questions. Was he truly a victim of his own mind, pushed to the brink by the truths he had uncovered? Or was this a cover-up, an orchestrated event designed to silence a whistleblower whose knowledge threatened to unravel the very fabric of global power? What we do know is that the story doesn't end here. What happened to this family remains a mystery, one that continues to haunt everyone who was involved. And with each passing day, the question looms larger: was this a tragic case of a man pushed to the brink? Or was it the chilling work of those who had too much to lose? For weeks, we've been uncovering the mystery, examining the events leading up to that fateful day. But now, the moment has arrived. The man at the center of this chilling tale, the man whose life and death have left more questions than answers, was none other than Philip Marshall. Philip Marshall was no ordinary man. Marshall's name began circulating in the realm of conspiracy theorists and investigative journalists when he became one of the most vocal critics of the official narrative surrounding the tragic events of September 11, 2001. A man who had flown through the skies of the world's most secure airspaces, he began to ask questions that others, many too afraid to voice, had been too afraid to address. Could the government, and specifically the CIA, have played a role in the events of that day? Was there a cover-up in the aftermath, designed to hide the truth from the public? In his writings, Marshall revealed a bombshell claim that shook the very foundations of what the public had been told. He argued that the United States government, specifically intelligence agencies like the CIA, had been complicit in orchestrating, or at the very least allowing, the events of 9/11 to unfold as they did. His book, The Big Bamboozle, 9/11 and the War on Terror, delved deep into the timeline, the connections, and the unanswered questions that, in Marshall's mind, could not be ignored. His central thesis was startlingly clear: the official narrative was a lie, and those in power had used the tragedy to further their own agendas. But Marshall's claims were not just speculative or based on vague theories. He had hard evidence, documents, flight logs, communications, and his own personal experiences. He had spent years piecing together the puzzle, following the threads that connected intelligence agencies, military contractors, and high-level officials with the events that transpired on that infamous day. According to Marshall, the story that had been presented to the world was a carefully constructed illusion, a lie that was designed to manipulate the public and justify a series of wars and policies that would benefit a select few at the top. His findings didn't just implicate the CIA. They exposed a web of connections between defense contractors, oil magnates, and political elites that spanned decades. Marshall believed that the true motivation behind 9/11 was not just a terrorist attack but a calculated move by those who stood to profit from the ensuing chaos and war. His research pointed to a long-standing alliance between government agencies and powerful corporations that had been operating in the shadows, out of reach of the public scrutiny. Marshall's investigation wasn't confined to books or articles. As someone who had worked in aviation, he had intimate knowledge of the systems and operations that many believed were secure. He had flown the same routes, worked with the same agencies, and understood the vulnerabilities in the system that most people could never even imagine. Marshall argued that the failures on September 11 were not simply the result of incompetence, as the government claimed, but part of a larger, deliberate scheme. In interviews, Marshall revealed how he had been approached by other insiders, whistleblowers, and sources who shared disturbing stories, some of which he would later weave into his narrative. These individuals spoke of covert operations, government cover-ups, and actions taken by the CIA that were never meant to see the light of day. Marshall was determined to expose these truths, regardless of the personal cost. But as he got closer to the truth, the stakes grew higher. The more Marshall revealed, the more he was targeted. He began to receive threats, anonymous calls, cryptic messages, and warnings from people who made it clear that his life, and the lives of those closest to him, were in danger. His friends recalled that he had become increasingly paranoid in the months leading up to his death, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering who was watching him. He had even told a few confidants that he feared for his family's safety and that he believed they were being followed, monitored, and harassed by unknown forces. In his final months, Marshall tried to prepare for the worst. He encrypted his documents, backed up his research, and attempted to contact journalists who he hoped could carry on his work if something were to happen to him. In one of his final messages to a close friend, he stated that if he were to die under suspicious circumstances, the public should know that it was not a suicide. "I know too much," he wrote. "They will stop at nothing to silence me." Marshall's writings and interviews, however, continued to circulate, and his findings sparked a wave of debate among researchers, journalists, and independent investigators. But for many, the questions surrounding his death raised even more suspicion about the events he had uncovered. Why had a man with such a reputation, such compelling evidence, and such a desperate desire to expose the truth been silenced in this way? Was it truly a murder-suicide, as the authorities claimed, or had Philip Marshall become another casualty in a larger, ongoing battle to keep the truth hidden from the public? The man who died so tragically in his own home was Philip Marshall. A man whose quest for the truth led him to uncover a conspiracy that, if exposed, could shake the very foundations of our understanding of history. His death, just like his life, remains shrouded in mystery. Was it the tragic outcome of a whistleblower caught in the crossfire of global politics and intelligence operations? Or was it a calculated act of silencing someone who had gotten too close to the truth? The questions linger, and they won't be easily answered. But one thing is certain: Philip Marshall was a man who was willing to risk everything to expose what he knew. And in the end, it cost him everything. As we reach the final stretch of this investigation, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The official narrative suggests that Philip Marshall's death was nothing more than a tragic act of desperation, an act of a man who had grown overwhelmed by the weight of his own findings. But what if the truth is far darker? What if Marshall's death wasn't a coincidence, but a calculated move by those with far too much to lose? To understand the true nature of what happened, we must examine the competing theories that surround his untimely death. On one hand, we have the official explanation: a murder-suicide. The authorities suggested that Marshall, disillusioned by the mounting pressure of his research and the stress it had caused on his personal life, had taken the lives of his children and then his own. This conclusion, however, has done little to calm the suspicion of those who followed his story. Let's start with the glaring inconsistencies in the official report. For one, there were no signs of forced entry into the Marshall home. Everything appeared to be undisturbed, suggesting that the family knew their killer, or killers. Yet, the authorities quickly closed the case, claiming that Marshall had acted alone in a fit of despair. But if Marshall had been under such immense pressure, why did he not reach out to the people closest to him? Why had he never shown signs of being suicidal, especially given his prolific work as a writer and public speaker? His family, his friends, and even his colleagues described him as determined, passionate, and unyielding in his pursuit of the truth. Could such a person really have fallen so far? Then, there are the details that don't add up. First, the locked door of the room where Marshall's body was discovered. According to initial reports, it was locked from the inside, a curious detail that raises questions about how Marshall could have committed suicide in such a manner. Was there someone else inside the house that night, someone who was responsible for the deaths of the family members and possibly for planting the evidence that pointed to Marshall as the perpetrator? Further complicating the official narrative is the lack of any credible motive. Marshall had a large network of supporters, many of whom were following his work on September 11th and the alleged cover-up. His death would silence one of the few individuals willing to publicly expose the shadowy figures behind the global events of 9/11, but would anyone truly believe that someone like Marshall, intelligent, methodical, and far too aware of the implications of his discoveries, would throw everything away in such a violent and senseless act? Now, let's consider the alternative theories, the ones that refuse to accept the easy answers. Some have pointed to the possibility that Marshall's death was not a suicide at all, but a carefully orchestrated assassination. The theory suggests that Marshall had become too close to the truth, and those in power, particularly within intelligence agencies, had deemed him a liability. The argument is clear: Marshall knew too much, and he had to be silenced before his revelations could expose those responsible for orchestrating 9/11 and the ongoing wars that followed. Could it be that Marshall had simply become another casualty in the quiet war being waged behind the scenes, a war to protect secrets that the public was never meant to know? There are other whistleblower cases to consider, some eerily similar to Marshall's. Take, for example, the case of Michael Ruppert, a former LAPD officer turned investigative journalist who also uncovered deep ties between intelligence agencies, the drug trade, and the events surrounding 9/11. Ruppert, too, was found dead in a manner that left many questions unanswered, with the official narrative suggesting suicide, though his supporters remained adamant that he had been killed for what he knew. Or there's the tragic story of Gary Webb, the investigative journalist who exposed the CIA's involvement in drug trafficking, whose career was destroyed by the fallout and whose death was ultimately ruled a suicide, despite the doubts of those who knew him best. Both men, like Marshall, were brought down by their efforts to expose dangerous truths. These cases raise unsettling questions about the fate of those who step into the role of whistleblower, those who risk everything to reveal the secrets of powerful institutions. Is it simply a coincidence that those who threaten to uncover the truth about government corruption or intelligence failures often end up dead under mysterious circumstances? Or is there a coordinated effort to silence them, to bury their findings, and to prevent the public from discovering the uncomfortable realities that lie behind closed doors? Philip Marshall's death is not the only case where a whistleblower has been silenced or pushed to the brink. Time and time again, we see similar patterns emerge. People who try to expose uncomfortable truths are discredited, marginalized, or, in some tragic cases, killed. With each new case, the theory of a coordinated cover-up becomes more plausible. But if this is the case, who is behind these efforts to silence those who know too much? As we continue to search for answers, we are left with an unsettling question: was Philip Marshall's death simply a tragic coincidence, a man pushed to the edge by the weight of his own discoveries? Or was his death a deliberate act of silencing, a message sent to others who might be considering following in his footsteps and exposing the dark secrets that continue to define the world we live in? In the end, the unanswered questions linger, and the mystery remains. The truth, if it ever comes to light, could change everything. But until that day comes, the story of Philip Marshall is a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who dare to speak out against the powerful forces that govern our world. As we close the chapter on the story of Philip Marshall, we are left with more questions than answers. His death, shrouded in mystery and riddled with inconsistencies, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of exposing secrets that some would go to any lengths to protect. Marshall was a man who refused to turn away, a man who believed that the truth was worth any sacrifice, no matter the cost. But in the world he found himself in, where those with the power to shape history also hold the power to erase inconvenient truths, it's clear that uncovering the truth doesn't come without a heavy price. The question remains: how far are the powers that be willing to go to silence those who threaten to expose them? Perhaps Marshall's death was a tragic consequence of a man driven to his breaking point by the weight of his own discoveries. But what if it wasn't? What if it was something far more deliberate, a calculated act to ensure that certain truths remain buried? We may never know the full extent of what Philip Marshall uncovered, but his story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers faced by those who challenge the powerful. Now, we turn to you. What do you think happened to Philip Marshall? Was he truly silenced, or was his death something else entirely? Was it a tragic consequence of his own unraveling, or was he taken out to prevent the world from knowing the truth he was about to reveal? The answers may lie in the shadows, but your thoughts and theories could help bring them into the light. We encourage you to share your reflections below. What do you believe happened? What can we learn from his story, and what does it mean for the whistleblowers who continue to stand up against the forces of secrecy and power? And as always, if you want to stay updated on more untold stories, more dangerous truths, and the mysteries that refuse to fade, don't forget to subscribe. Join us as we continue to ask the questions that need to be answered, uncover the stories that have been silenced, and reveal the truth, no matter the cost.